Hi, in this video we'll be looking at the pros and cons of monopolies. So a pure monopoly is a market which only has one firm operating within it, but this is very rare, so other definitions would say a firm is a monopoly if it has more than 25% market share, and these pros and cons should apply to both of these definitions, just generally a very large firm within an industry. So what are some of the pros of a monopoly? Well, the first one would be that we can have natural monopolies. This is where in some industries it makes sense for there to be only one business operating. These are industries where there are very high fixed costs. For example, we often see one company supplying water within an economy or a certain area. This is because it makes sense for there to only be one set of water pipes. So we can make a note of water. If other firms were to then enter the water market, they would have to lay a whole new network of pipes, which would cost a huge amount of money and wouldn't really have any benefit. It's thus more efficient to just have one firm and then regulate that firm just to make sure that they provide the correct amount of the service and that the price doesn't get too high. The next benefit of monopolies will be for employment. So monopolists are very large firms, which means that they can employ a lot of workers. And since these companies are very secure in their market, they don't need to compete with other firms. So the jobs created by the monopolist will often be long-term positions. People who have these jobs have good job security. The local economy can thus benefit from the creation of jobs from monopolies. So the next benefit of monopolies is going to be economies of scale. And as we've said, by definition, monopolies are very large businesses. This large size means that they can benefit from economies of scale. I go through this in more detail in another video, but this means monopolies often have very low average costs, or AC, because monopolies benefit from things like buying raw materials in bulk, so there's a lower average cost. They can buy specialist equipment and generally have automated production lines which have division of labour. So generally the average cost of producing one unit is going to be lower than a small competitive business or a business within a competitive industry. The final 3 points are all somewhat related to each other. So I guess starting with long-term investment, since monopolies are usually very secure in their market, they can invest in long-term projects as they aren't afraid of going out of business anytime soon. So they can invest for, say, the next 10, 20, or even more years. They also make high levels of profit, which gives them funds to invest in things like research and development. This innovation to develop and improve products for the future leads to what we call dynamic efficiency. And ultra-competitive markets may not have enough profit to be able to invest in the same way as monopolies do. So this long-term investment, it can lead to dynamic efficiency, and, well, long-term investment will sort of cause us to have lower average costs as, say, a company can develop better processes of doing things, new technologies that can reduce their costs, and generally people are going to be better off because products just cost less and they have lower prices as a knock-on consequence of this innovation. And the existence of monopolies in general actually acts as an incentive for businesses to innovate. The fact that we have intellectual property rights, such as patents and copyright, mean firms can innovate without having their ideas stolen, so they can make high levels of profit. If there were no monopolies, firms may not want to invest in developing new ideas because everyone else could just steal all their innovation and there's not much point to actually innovating at all. So a lot of people see monopolies as a bad thing, but we've shown here that there are clear benefits, and in some industries, such as natural monopoly industries like water, maybe electricity and so on, it does make a lot of sense for us to have a monopoly operating. So let's look at some of the cons or the drawbacks of monopolies now. So one obvious one is that there's reduced choice, as, well, there's only one firm in the market, so there'll be fewer options for consumers to choose from than in a competitive market. And we usually view having more choice, more different options, as a good thing, as people with different preferences can then choose what they like best. So reduced choice, an obvious one. The next one is that monopolies are productively inefficient. And I won't completely explain the monopoly diagram, but I've sketched one out somewhat poorly on just here. And going through this in detail is a topic for another video. But on this diagram, we see that, well, if we assume that a monopoly is going to maximize its profits, well, we choose its production point that its marginal cost is equal to its marginal revenue, so it will produce at this location. And we note that it doesn't produce at the lowest point on its average cost curve. So its average cost curve is this AC curve, and we're producing here, whereas the average cost is at its lowest point there. And I haven't illustrated it too well on this diagram, but the point is that the average cost is slightly higher in a monopoly. And this means that we are productively inefficient, as the monopoly could have lower average costs, and in a competitive market, we would operate at this point. So that is what productive inefficiency is. Because a monopoly has market power, it can choose where it wants to produce, and so this isn't the optimal value within the market. Monopolies are also allocatively inefficient, and we can see this on the same diagram. So we said that a monopoly will choose to produce it where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, and if we use our demand curve, which is also our average revenue curve, we can see that the monopoly will choose this price PM. So the monopoly clearly charges a price which is higher than marginal revenue, because our marginal revenue curve is down here. So the price mechanism is not allocating our goods in an efficient way. And in a competitive market, we would see that our price is equal to our marginal revenue, and this is also equal to our marginal cost curve being here. And when we have our price equal to marginal cost, well, what consumers are paying for a good is what that good actually costs to produce, and we see this as efficient. When we have our price higher than our marginal cost and our marginal revenue, producers are being over-rewarded for the goods they produce, and this is how they're going to make a profit. So in a competitive market, we have allocative efficiency. In a monopoly, we have allocative inefficiency. And again, we saw on our diagram that with a monopoly, we have underconsumption. Because monopolies are maximizing profits, again, they choose marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, and so they can produce less of a good and increase its price. And this is actually shown on our next diagram, which we'll use to illustrate a future point, but that in a competitive market, we would produce at, say, QC, but in a monopoly, we'd produce at QM, and the monopoly produces less. So this means that in a monopoly, consumers aren't getting as much of the good as they want. So there is therefore underconsumption. Some people that want the good will not be able to get it because the price is higher than it should be due to the monopoly increasing prices. So that is a drawback. We also said that monopolies can innovate more than competitive markets. So this may seem like we're saying the opposite thing, but the point is that there's actually less incentive for innovation. Monopolies aren't competing against other firms, and they're already earning profits, so they don't need to innovate. What we said before is that they can innovate because they have security in their market, they have profits which they're able to innovate, but this doesn't mean that they will do. They can get complacent because they don't need to. They don't have anyone competing against them. So potentially we could see less innovation in these markets, and so there are two factors weighing against each other. They are able to innovate more, but they may just choose not to because they can just cash out that money, say pay their shareholders and so on, instead of reinvesting it into the company. Similarly, because monopolies make positive profits, they may just generally have inefficient processes. They aren't desperately trying to always minimize costs in every department because they don't need to. A struggling company in a competitive market will try to find any possible way to reduce its costs, but monopolies might not because they'll make a profit anyway. They don't need to cut all costs, and this is called X inefficiency. The final point is going to be that there is a deadweight welfare loss in society due to monopolies. Basic economic theory says that the costs of monopolies outweigh the benefits, and we can see this here on this diagram I mentioned before. In a competitive market, we would produce quantity QC, and so if we run this up to our demand curve, we'd see that this would give us a price PC, and a monopoly would produce this quantity, which would give us a price PM. So if we look at this diagram, what do we see from moving from, say, a competitive market to a monopoly market? Well, the price has increased. So this area here has transferred from the consumer to the producer. This is now a producer surplus, and consumers have lost this because of the increase in price. And this blue area here is still just consumer surplus in both markets. And what we're left with is a deadweight welfare loss of this area. And so there's a general loss of welfare to society. So that's another drawback. However, in reality, some monopolies may be good for society and others may be bad. And in practice, governments can just try to regulate monopolies to ensure we get the benefits without suffering too much from the costs. So in some markets, they can be good. In other ones, we'd prefer our markets to be competitive. But that is the pros and cons of monopolies. If you found this video useful, please do leave a like rating. Make sure to check out the channel for more videos like this one, and subscribe to add some econ to your subscription feed.